The air in the eastern Mediterranean had grown heavy, thick with the scent of fear and ambition. It was the summer of 480 BC, and a storm was brewing not in the skies, but on the land. From the east, from the unimaginably vast and wealthy empire of Persia, came a force so large it was said to drink rivers dry and make the very earth tremble under its march. This was the army of Xerxes, the great king, a man who believed he was the rightful ruler of every nation under the sun. His father had tried to punish the rebellious Greek city-states a decade before and had failed. Now, Xerxes would finish the job. He moved not just as a general, but as a god-king on a procession of conquest, and his goal was nothing less than the total absorption of the rocky, defiant peninsula of Greece into his endless domain. The numbers were staggering, meant to paralyze the mind before a single arrow was ever fired. Ancient sources speak of 1 million men, maybe more. Modern historians settle on a still astounding force, perhaps 150,000 fighting men, maybe 200,000, trailed by a vast train of cooks, servants, slaves, and concubines. It was a moving city, a nation on the march. Its navy, hundreds upon hundreds of warships from Egypt, Phoenicia, and Ionia, shattered it along the coast. The point was not just to win, but to overwhelm, to crush the spirit of resistance under the sheer, undeniable weight of imperial power. Xerxes' messengers rode ahead of this tidal wave, entering Greek towns not with requests, but with demands. They asked for simple tokens, a cup of earth and a flask of water. These were not gifts of hospitality. They were symbols. To give them was to offer the land and the lifeblood of your people. It was to submit, to kneel, and to become just another province in the Persian machine. Many, looking at the map and hearing the reports of the endless columns of soldiers, did just that. They saw the futility. What were their little walled towns and bands of farmers-turned soldiers against the master of the world? They gave the earth and water, choosing survival over freedom. But in the south, in the rocky, fierce land of the Peloponnese and the clever, seafaring city of Athens, a different answer was forming. It was born not from confidence, but from desperation. Two cities, normally rivals, even enemies, saw the same stark choice: submit and lose everything they were, or fight and maybe, just maybe, find a way to survive. Sparta was a society forged for war. Its citizens, the Spartiates, lived a life of brutal discipline from childhood. Comfort was a weakness. Individuality was a threat to the unit. They were the ultimate soldiers, and their reputation was a weapon in itself. Athens was different, a bubbling, noisy, creative place where citizens argued in assemblies, traded across the seas, and built beautiful temples. They had a new, fragile idea called democracy. These two worlds could hardly have been more different, but the Persian threat forced them into an awkward, tense alliance. They were joined by others: Corinthians, men of the sea; Thebans, proud and powerful; and men from smaller cities who decided that a life of slavery was no life at all. But an alliance doesn't win battles. Strategy does. And the Persian problem was a simple one of mathematics. How do you stop an army that outnumbers you 50 to 1? The Greek generals and politicians, meeting in hurried councils, knew they could not meet this force on an open plain. They would be surrounded and annihilated. They needed a bottleneck, a place where the Persian numbers wouldn't matter, where courage and armor and long spears could make the difference. The answer lay in the north, on the main coastal road into central Greece. It was a place called Thermopylae. The name meant hot gates, for the sulphurous springs that bubbled nearby. It was a pass barely 50 feet wide in places, with the steep, rugged mountains of Kallidromos on one side and the treacherous Malian Gulf on the other. Here, an army could be channeled like water into a narrow pipe. Here, a few could hold back many. The plan was not to win a decisive war-ending victory. That was a fantasy. The plan was to delay, to frustrate, to bleed the Persian giant and buy precious, irreplaceable time. Time for the main Greek armies to gather and organize further south. Time for the powerful Athenian navy, the fleet of sleek, fast triremes, to position itself to attack the Persian supply lines. Thermopylae was a speed bump, but a deadly one. It was a gamble with very high stakes. The man chosen to lead this desperate holding action was the Spartan king Leonidas. He was not a young man, likely in his 50s, hardened by a lifetime of the Spartan regimen. He understood the mission perfectly. Hold the pass until you are relieved, or until you are told to withdraw. But Sparta was bound by its own strict, unyielding laws. A major religious festival, the Carnea, was underway, and during this time, Spartan law forbade sending the full army to war. It was a cruel twist of fate. The entire machine built for war was paralyzed by its own rituals. Leonidas did not waver. He would go, not with the army, but with his personal royal guard. These were 300 Spartiate warriors, each one a father of living sons, so his family line would not die with him. They were not reckless youths, but seasoned, mature soldiers who understood duty down to their bones. They were joined by perhaps 1,000 or more helots, the servile class of Sparta, who carried their gear and fought as light infantry. This was not the Spartan army. It was a symbol of it, a spearhead. As this small force marched north, something remarkable happened. Other allied forces, hearing of the mission and the king who would lead it, joined them. Men from Tegea, Mantinia, Arcadia, from Corinth and Phlius and Mycenae. Hoplites, the citizen soldiers of Greece, picked up their heavy bronze helmets, their breastplates, their round shields and long thrusting spears, and fell in step. They were not bound by Spartan law. They were bound by the shared understanding of what was coming. By the time they assembled at Thermopylae, the force numbered just over 4,000 hoplites, plus their attendant light troops. 4,000. They looked at the narrow pass, then looked east, down the coastal road where the horizon was beginning to shimmer with the dust of a world on the move. They set to work, repairing an old, crumbling wall built by a local people years before. They built their camp. They waited. The math was impossible. The mission was clear. And somewhere in the distance, the first glint of sunlight on 1,000,000 polished spear tips began to appear on the edge of the world. The dust cloud on the eastern horizon wasn't a cloud anymore. It was a stain, a spreading blot that swallowed the light. Then it became a rumble you could feel through the soles of your sandals, a low, constant thunder of countless feet, hooves, and wheels. Finally, the stain resolved into a sight that would freeze the blood of any sane man. As far as the eye could see, down the narrow coastal track and spilling out onto the plains beyond, was an ocean of men and steel. Polished spear points formed a shimmering metallic haze. The colorful robes of a dozen different nations' Medes in patterned tunics, Scythians with their woven shields, Scythians in fur-trimmed hats, created a terrifying tapestry. The Greeks, 4,000 strong behind their rebuilt wall, watched in silence. This was the army of the God King. It filled the world. Xerxes, seated on a throne placed on a hill overlooking the pass, was in no hurry. He had been told of this small force blocking his way. To him, it was an absurdity, a joke. Perhaps they would see his glory and simply run. He waited 4 days. The message was one of pure, arrogant power. Asterisk, look upon what you oppose. Understand your folly. Disappear. Asterisk, but the Greeks did not disappear. They drilled. They sharpened their spears. They ate their meager rations. Their silence was an answer more defiant than any shout. On the 5th day, Xerxes' patience expired. The joke was over. He gave the order. The first wave surged forward. These were not his best troops. He sent in the Medes and the Scythians, fierce fighters from the heart of the empire. The logic was simple. Let them wear the Greeks down, then the real soldiers would finish it. The narrow pass funneled the charging men into a bottleneck. What happened next was not a battle. It was a slaughterhouse exercise. The Greeks had chosen their ground with the cold eye of masters. The phalanx, their fighting formation, was a wall of bronze, wood, and flesh. Each hoplite's large, round shield protected not only himself, but the man to his left, creating an interlocked, nearly impenetrable barrier. Their spears, nearly 9 feet long, projected over the top of that shield wall. The Persians, armed with shorter spears and wicker shields designed for open field skirmishes, were horrifically outmatched in this cramped space. They could not flank the Greeks. They could only come straight at them, a few dozen at a time, into a forest of deadly spear points. The sound was deafening, the metallic crash of bronze on wicker, the sickening thud of iron-piercing flesh, the shouts of the Greeks in their deep, rhythmic war chants, the screams of the wounded and dying. The Medes fought bravely, but they were butchered. They could not get close. Greek spears punched through shields, armor, and bone. When a spear shaft snapped, the hoplite simply stepped back, drew his short sword, and another fresh man from behind stepped into the front line, his long spear already leveled. The Greeks fought in shifts, a brutal, efficient rotation that kept the front line perpetually strong and relatively rested. The pass floor grew slick with blood and gore. Broken Persian arrows littered the ground like a strange, deadly crop. From his throne, Xerxes watched, his initial amusement turning to confusion, then to fury. His men were being fed into a machine. He called off the Medes. Surely his elite troops, his famous 10,000 immortals, so called because their number was always kept at 10,000, any dead or wounded immediately replaced, would break this stubborn wall. The immortals moved forward with more discipline, their reputation preceding them. They were the best of Persia. They fared no better. The terrain was the great equalizer, the ultimate enemy. Their numerical advantage was meaningless. They could not use their archers effectively, as the Greeks' heavy bronze armor and shields deflected most arrows. It was back to the grim, close-quarter pushing match, and against the heavier, more heavily armored Greeks, they were outpushed. The Spartans, in particular, used a tactic that seemed almost like a cruel game. They would sometimes turn and flee in a seeming panic, drawing excited Persians deeper into the pass. Then, on a shouted command, they would wheel around in perfect unison, reforming their wall and cutting down the disordered pursuers. It was a systematic, demoralizing beating. The day wore on. The piles of Persian dead grew so high they became obstacles. The air stank of death and sweat. The Greeks, though holding, were not untouched. Men grew exhausted under the relentless sun and the constant pressure. Wounds were taken a lucky arrow in a gap of armor. A spear thrust, they found its mark. The wounded were dragged behind the lines, their places taken immediately. There was no panic, only a grim, weary determination. They knew they were winning the day, but they also knew the Persian well was bottomless. Their own strength was finite. At one point, it is said that a Spartan, told that the Persian arrows would be so numerous they would blot out the sun, simply shrugged and said, "Good, then we will fight in the shade." It wasn't just bravado, it was the mindset. The threat of death was irrelevant. The only thing that mattered was the line. Hold the line. The man next to you is your brother, your city, your entire world. You do not let him down. As dusk fell on that first day of combat, the attacks finally ceased. The immortals pulled back, bloodied and baffled. The pass was silent, save for the moans of the dying and the clatter of Greeks clearing the corpses from their front. They had done the impossible. They had stood against the full might of the great king's first assault and had not budged an inch. Around their cooking fires that night, there would have been no triumphant celebration. Only the quiet repairs of gear, the tending of wounds, and the knowledge that tomorrow would be worse. Xerxes, in his lavish tent, was a man transformed. The easy confidence was gone, replaced by a simmering, furious anxiety. His generals argued. Some suggested using their cavalry, but the ground was utterly unfit for horses. Others whispered of flanking maneuvers, but scouts reported the mountains were guarded by local Greek allies. For the first time, the god-king faced a problem his sheer power could not immediately solve. The next day, he threw everything he had again. Different contingents, fresh troops from the depths of his empire, were hurled at the Greek wall. And again, the result was the same: a horrific waste of life for no gain. The Greek wall of bronze and will stood firm. 2 days of catastrophic losses, 2 days of humiliation. The Persian army's morale, once sky-high, began to curdle. They had crossed continents, seen kingdoms fall, and now they were being held hostage by a tiny band of madmen in a crack in the mountains. In the Greek camp, the mood was different. They were exhausted, yes. Their arms felt like lead from the constant fighting. But they had done it. They were proving the plan could work. They were buying that precious time for their homeland. A fragile, fierce hope began to kindle. Maybe, just maybe, they could hold this pass until the Allied armies were ready. Maybe they could actually win this delaying action and get to go home. It was at this moment, as Xerxes slumped on his throne, racked with frustration, that a figure was brought before him. He was a local man from the nearby hills. He had no loyalty to the distant Greek cities. He saw a winning side, and he wanted a reward. His name was Ephialtes, and he had information to sell. He knew of a path, a goat trail, hidden and treacherous, but passable. A path that led over the mountains and came out behind the Greek position. The news must have hit Xerxes like a lightning bolt. The solution. The end of the nightmare. He promised Ephialtes riches beyond his dreams. And as the sun set on the second day, a picket force of the king's best, the immortals began to move quietly out of camp, not towards the hot, bloody mouth of the pass, but into the cold, dark shadows of the mountains that flanked it. The clock was now ticking on the Greeks, and they didn't even know it yet. The night after that second brutal day was different. It wasn't the quiet of exhaustion, but the eerie, prickling quiet of suspicion. The Persians had pulled back, but their campfires across the plain glowed like a field of low, watchful stars. There were too many of them. The Greek sentries, perched on the rough stone of the pass walls, strained their ears. They weren't listening for the usual sounds of an army at rest. They were listening for silence from the wrong places. Up in the black, jagged teeth of the mountains that rose to their left, the Kalidromos range. Local Greek allies, men from the nearby city of Phocis, were stationed up there to guard the secret goat trails. Their job was to warn of any flanking move. The night wore on, cold and still. Then, just before the first gray light of dawn touched the sky, the silence broke. Not with the sound of battle, but with the sound of desperate running feet. A figure stumbled into the Greek camp at the wall, gasping for air, his clothes torn by the mountain brush. He was a Phocian sentry. His eyes were wide with a terror that wasn't from a direct fight. He brought news that turned the stomach of every man who heard it. The Persians were in the mountains. Not a small scouting party, but a large, elite force, the Immortals. They had found a traitor, a local shepherd who showed them the Anopia path. The Phocians, positioned on the hilltops, had been spotted. Instead of holding the narrow path themselves, they had panicked at the sight of the expert Persian troops, mistaking their direction, and had retreated to a higher defensive position. The Persians, ignoring them, had marched right on by. They were now well behind schedule because of the tough climb, but they were on the move. By mid-morning, they would descend behind the hot gates. The Greek position, the brilliant bottleneck, was about to become a perfect trap. The camp erupted into a low, urgent chaos. Men who had just minutes before been sleeping the dead sleep of the utterly spent were now on their feet, clutching spears, voices tight with a new kind of fear. This was the scenario they had all secretly dreaded. This changed everything. All the courage in the world meant nothing if you were surrounded and attacked from behind in a place with no escape. They turned as one body to their king. Leonidas called a hurried council of the allied captains as the sky lightened. The facts were cold and hard, like the mountain stone around them. The strategic reason for holding the pass, to delay the Persians and protect the main Greek armies mustering to the south, was now over. The delay had been bought, 2 priceless days of it, paid for in Persian blood. But the mission had suddenly, violently shifted. If they stayed, they would be annihilated to the last man, and for no further strategic gain. It was a simple, brutal calculation. The Spartan king made his decision. He would not order the entire allied force to die in a trap. The original plan was finished. He spoke calmly, his voice cutting through the panic. The allies, he said, should go. Now, withdraw south, rejoin the main forces, and fight another day. The Spartan law that had sent him with only 300 men now took on a different, darker meaning. He and his Spartans had been sent by their city to hold the pass. They had not been relieved. They had not been ordered to retreat. To abandon their post, even under these impossible conditions, would be to break their deepest code, to dishonor everything they were. For the Spartans, there was no choice at all. It was never about winning this battle. It was about holding their line. But then something happened that would etch this moment into legend forever. The men from Thespia, about 700 of them, stepped forward. Their commander looked at Leonidas. They were not bound by Spartan law. They could leave with honor, having fought with incredible bravery for 2 days. But they refused. They would stay. Their reason was simpler, perhaps, but just as profound. This was their land, their piece of Greece. They would not abandon their allies, and they would not give the Persians an easy victory. They would see it through. Then came the men from Thebes, about 400 of them. Historians have argued about them for centuries. Leonidas, it is said, essentially kept them as hostages, suspecting their city's loyalty to the Greek cause was shaky. They may have stayed under duress, a bitter footnote to the day's nobility. As the sun finally cleared the horizon, painting the bloody pass in a cruel, golden light, the order was given. The majority of the allies, the Corinthians, the Arcadians, the men from Mycenae, and other cities gathered their gear. The mood was a chaotic mix of relief, shame, and overwhelming grief. They clasped arms with the men staying, wordless looks passing between them that said everything. There were no long speeches. Then they turned and began the hurried march south, away from the trap, their footsteps echoing dully. Behind them, they left a force of roughly 1,400 men, 300 Spartans, 700 Thespians, 400 Thebans, and a few hundred others who may have stayed, including the helots who served the Spartans. They watched their comrades leave. The noise of the retreating army faded, leaving behind a silence more immense than any they had ever known. The wall they had defended for 2 days now felt like a tomb they had chosen. Leonidas did something, then that speaks volumes. He didn't order his men to dig in behind the wall and wait to be surrounded. That was a death of passive waiting. He chose a different death. He would march out into the pass, into the wider ground before it bottlenecked. He would meet the Persian front assault head-on, with everything he had, and inflict as much damage as possible before the flanking force arrived at his back. It was an act of pure offensive fury, a statement. They ate a last, simple meal. The Spartans are said to have combed their long hair, a ritual before death. Then they formed their phalanx, not at the wall, but in front of it. They advanced into the morning light, a tiny, compact square of bronze and determination, moving toward the seething, vast army of Xerxes. The Persians, seeing this small group advance, were at first confused, then wary. They remembered the carnage of the past 2 days. But Xerxes, now confident of his flanking move, ordered a full frontal attack. He wanted this finished. The battle that morning was unlike the 2 before. It was unrelenting, desperate, and fought on more open ground. The Greeks, knowing this was the end, fought with a reckless, transcendent abandon. They broke formation not to retreat, but to kill. They drove deep into the Persian ranks, their spears and swords working in a grim, efficient rhythm. But the pressure was too great. Men fell. The formation tightened, stepping over the bodies of their friends. Slowly, fighting every inch of the way, they were pushed back past their old wall, into the narrowest part of the pass itself. And then the news they had been waiting for, dreading, came. Shouts from the rear. The flash of Persian armor from the hills behind them. The immortals had arrived. The trap was sprung. The remaining Greeks, now perhaps a few hundred, were forced to retreat onto a small hillock, a last piece of high ground near the wall. It was surrounded. Here they made their final stand. Their spears were long gone, shattered. They fought with swords. When their swords broke, they used their hands, their teeth, stones from the ground. The Persians, wary of getting too close to these dying demons, finally held back. They didn't need to charge anymore. Xerxes gave the order. His archers, thousands of them, were brought forward. They formed ranks on all sides, surrounding the little hill. They nocked their arrows, drew back their bows. The sky for a moment darkened. Then came the sound, a hiss that grew into a roar, like a sudden, deadly storm. The arrows fell in a thick, black rain, blotting out the sun. On that hill there was no more fighting. Only the thud of arrows finding their marks in wood, in earth, and in flesh. The last Greeks were buried under the weight of the Persian missile fire. Every single one of them. Not a man on that hill was left standing. The silence that followed was heavy and complete. The mighty Persian army, at last, moved forward through the pass, stepping over the carpet of their own dead from the previous days, and finally, over the bodies of the fallen Greeks on the hill. They had taken the hot gates, but as they marched through, not a man among them could have felt like a true victor. They had been stopped, humiliated, and bled white by a force they outnumbered beyond counting. And the man on the throne, watching his army finally flow through the gap, felt no joy. Only a deep, unsettling relief and a new, knowing fear. If this was what a few thousand Greeks could do, what awaited him in the lands beyond? The pass was open, but the legend had just been born, and it was marching south ahead of him, faster than any army could move. The silence didn't last. It was broken by the deep, rhythmic thumping of spear butts on hardened earth. From the small hill where the last Greeks had made their stand, now strewn with the fallen, the sound echoed. It was a slow, deliberate drumbeat of defiance. The Persians surrounding the hill, arrows still nocked, hesitated. They watched, confused, as a handful of figures pushed themselves up from the carnage. Not all had been killed by the storm of arrows. Some, sheltered by the bodies of their comrades, or protected by their battered shields, had survived. Bleeding, broken, but not finished. They were maybe a few dozen. Spartans mostly, and a few Thespians. Their king was gone, but their will was not. They did not try to form their famous phalanx. That was impossible, no. Instead, they formed a tight knot, a final ring of bronze and flesh. They had no more speeches to give, no more grand gestures. There was only one thing left to do: take as many of the enemy with them as they could. They locked the remaining shields together, a last small wall. Then, as one, they let out a sound, not a shout, but a deep, guttural roar that came from a place beyond pain or fear, and they charged down the hill, into the sea of Persians. What followed was sheer, unadulterated chaos. It was not a battle of tactics, but of raw, desperate violence. The Greeks crashed into the Persian front lines like a hammer. They fought with a speed and ferocity that belied their wounds and exhaustion. A Spartan, his arm hanging useless, used his shield as a battering ram, knocking men down before driving his short sword into them with his good hand. A Thespian, an arrow jutting from his thigh, swung a broken spear shaft like a club. They fought back to back, moving in a slow, deadly whirlpool, carving a red circle in the Persian ranks. The Persians, for a few terrifying minutes, reeled. They had just won. The pass was open. They had shot these men down from a safe distance. And yet here they were, these ghosts from the hill, killing again. The shock gave the Greeks a moment of brutal advantage. They cut down scores of the enemy, their final burst of energy fueled by pure, undiluted rage. But the math, the relentless, crushing math of this whole campaign, reasserted itself. One Greek would be surrounded by 5 Persians. A spear would thrust from behind. A sword would cut a hamstring. One by one, the last defenders fell. The circle shrank and shrank again until there were only a handful left, then just a few. The fight became a series of isolated, horrifying duels in the mud. The last Spartan, it is said, fought until his sword broke, then used his hands until he was finally buried under a heap of attackers. And then there was true silence. The Persians stood, panting, surrounded by heaps of their own dead, looking at the small, terrible mound of Greek bodies at the center. There was no cheering, no celebration. The cost had been too grotesque. They had lost thousands. Some ancient sources claim up to 20,000 men, including 2 of Xerxes' own brothers. To kill 4,000, to clear a narrow row, Xerxes himself came down from his throne to walk the battlefield. The stories say he was unsettled, disturbed by what he saw. He found the body of Leonidas. The king's final act of defiance, leading that charge off the hill, had burned his image into the Persian mind. In a fit of rage and perhaps twisted respect, Xerxes ordered a final desecration. He had Leonidas' head cut off and impaled on a stake. It was a message of barbaric triumph, but it felt hollow, like the act of a man who needed to convince himself he had won something more than a bloody corridor. The Persian army, now free to move, began its slow, somber march through the pass. They stepped over the gruesome evidence of the last 3 days. The hot gates had earned their name in a new way, the heat of death, the heat of spilled blood soaking the ground. The victory parade felt more like a funeral procession through a charnel house, but the story didn't end in that pass. In fact, the most important part was just beginning. The sacrifice at Thermopylae had achieved its one vital goal. It had bought time, precious, irreplaceable days. While the Persians had been stuck, frustrated, and bleeding at the narrow gate, the rest of Greece had been scrambling. The Athenian fleet, the backbone of Greek naval power, had used those days to position itself perfectly. They lured the massive Persian navy into the narrow straits of Salamis near Athens. Just as the mountains had funneled the Persian army at Thermopylae, the sea channels at Salamis would funnel their ships. And when the Persian fleet sailed in, confident after their land victory, the smaller, nimbler Greek triremes rammed and destroyed them. It was a crushing naval defeat. Without his fleet, Xerxes' supply lines from Asia were cut. His massive army could no longer be fed. The king, his spirit broken more by Salamis than by Thermopylae, fled back to Persia with much of his army, leaving a general behind to finish the job. The next year, that remaining Persian force met a united, confident, and furious Greek army on the field at Plataea. And there, the Greeks did what they could not do at Thermopylae. They won a decisive, war-ending victory. They shattered the Persian army for good, securing the survival of their homeland. So, what was Thermopylae? It was not a victory in the military sense. It was a catastrophic defeat for the men who fought there. But it became something much bigger than a single battle. It became a symbol, a lesson. It proved that will could stand against overwhelming force. That freedom, for those willing to die for it, had a price, but also an unconquerable power. The story of the 300 Spartans and their allies was told and retold. It fueled the fires of Greek identity. It gave them the courage to fight on at Salamis and Plataea. The poet Simonides wrote their epitaph, carved into a stone at the pass. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. They had obeyed. They had held the line. And in doing so, they didn't just delay an army. They changed the course of history. They ensured that the ideas being born in those rocky Greek city-states ideas about democracy, about debate, about the individual, would have a chance to grow, to spread, and to shape the world for centuries to come. The hot gates slammed shut on the Persian advance, but they swung open the door to a future the great king could never have imagined. The dust settled over Thermopylae, but the story was just catching fire. It moved faster than any Persian cavalry unit, traveling on the shocked whispers of the surviving allies and the hushed, grim reports from Persian scouts. It swept through the villages and cities of Greece like a gale-force wind, a story not of defeat, but of something nobody had a word for yet. A small band of men had faced the impossible, had broken the great king's pride, and had chosen death on their own terms. The Persian army might be marching south, but this story was marching ahead of them, changing the landscape of fear itself. For Xerxes, the taste of victory at the hot gates was ash in his mouth. Yes, the road was open, but his army was shaken. They had seen a new kind of warfare, a kind where men did not break, where they seemed to welcome death. The cost in lives and, more importantly, in time, had been catastrophic. His grand, unstoppable timetable was in ruins. And while he had been stuck at that narrow pass, his real enemy had been working. That enemy was the Athenian fleet. The entire Greek strategy had hinged on two parts: the army delaying the Persians at Thermopylae, and the navy positioning for a killing blow. With the time Leonidas and his men had bought, the Athenian leader Themistocles had executed a brilliant, risky plan. He convinced the other Greek city-states to abandon the city of Athens itself. The Persians would march in and burn it to the ground, a devastating but expected loss. Meanwhile, the entire Greek navy, hundreds of trireme warships, gathered in the narrow straits of Salamis, an island just off the coast. Themistocles' genius was in the geography, again. Just like the mountain pass, the sea channel at Salamis was a bottleneck. The huge, bulky Persian fleet could not use its numbers. It had to crowd in, ship against ship, losing all maneuverability. And then, from the cover of the morning mist and the twisting channels, the Greek ships struck. They were lighter, faster, and their crews knew these waters intimately. They rammed the Persian vessels with brutal efficiency, shearing off oars and punching holes in hulls. The sea became a chaotic, sinking mass of wood and screaming men. The Persian admiral watched from a throne on shore, just as Xerxes had at Thermopylae, and witnessed his naval power being utterly destroyed in a single day. Salamis was the turning point. It was the victory that Thermopylae made possible. Without those 3 days of delay, the Greek fleet would never have been in position. The Persian navy would have had free rein, supporting the army as it marched. Now, Xerxes had a massive, hungry army in Greece, but his supply lines across the Aegean Sea were severed. His war machine was stranded. Fearing rebellion back home and a complete logistical disaster, the great king did something unthinkable. He packed up a large portion of his forces and retreated. He ran for home, leaving behind a still powerful army under his top general to finish the conquest the next year. But the Greece that army faced in 479 BC was not the same place. The spirit of Thermopylae had done its work. The story of the sacrifice had unified the often squabbling city-states in a way no politician as speech ever could. It was no longer about saving Athens or Sparta. It was about honoring the men who had died for all of them. A sense of common purpose, forged in the fire of that last stand, hardened into resolve. The final act played out on a broad plain near the town of Plataea. Here, the full might of the remaining Persian army faced the combined forces of a united Greece. This time, it was not a desperate delay. It was a set-piece battle for survival. The Greeks, their hoplite phalanxes now numbering in the tens of thousands, faced the Persians head-on. The fighting was fierce and long, but the Greek line held. Their discipline, their heavier armor, and a furious will to avenge Thermopylae carried the day. They broke the Persian army, chased it from the field, and effectively ended the invasion for good. On the same day, according to legend, the Greek fleet won another victory across the sea, wiping out the remnants of Persian naval power. So, what did Thermopylae truly mean? On a balance sheet of war, it was a loss. Every single man who stayed behind died. But war isn't just about balance sheets. It's about psychology, about momentum, about belief. Thermopylae was a shock to the system of the entire known world. It proved that the Persian Empire, for all its glory and size, was not invincible. It showed that free men, fighting for their homes and their way of life, could possess a strength that no whipped slave or paid mercenary could ever muster. The legend grew, as legends do. The focus settled on the 300 Spartans, their discipline making for a cleaner, more powerful symbol. But at its heart, the story was always about the 4,000 Spartans, Thespians, Thebans, and others, who made that first crucial stand. They were the dam that held back the flood just long enough for their people to build a wall. Their legacy is not one of military tactics, though the battle is still studied. Their legacy is one of the spirit. It's about the power of a choice. When given the option between a comfortable submission and a principled, dangerous resistance, they chose to resist. They knew the likely cost, and they paid it anyway. That idea that some things are worth dying for became a cornerstone of Western thought. It echoed in the halls of Roman senators facing barbarians, in the words of philosophers and poets, and centuries later, in the foundations of democracies that believed in the individual's right to stand against tyranny. The stone that was placed at Thermopylae bore a simple message for travelers. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. But the message the world heard was far louder. It said that courage could be a weapon, that sacrifice could be a seed for victory, and that the echo of a few thousand men, shouting their defiance in a rocky pass, could ring louder through history than the marching feet of 100,000. The hot gates closed behind them, but the path they guarded, the path to a future where their ideas could live on, remained open because they had stood their ground.